Cloudy in the west, looks like rain. Spent my last nickel on a subway train in New York City, in New York City, in New York City. You really got to know your line. The Fifth Avenue bus is the best in town, but if you only got a nickel, you gotta go underground in New York City, New York City. New York City, you really got to know your line. Player Memphis. Woody didn't like this. A gal came up to Woody. She said, Woody, Woody. Woody said he would, but the gal said, could in New York City, in New York City. In New York City, you really got to know your line. We sang on the subway, sang on the train, didn't matter where we came, fair or rain, New York City, in New York City, in New York City, you really got to know your line. Now there's lots more verses to this song. Best guy better be getting along in New York City, in New York City, New York City. You really got to know your line.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. And I wanted to say hello because I am today's speaker. But once the talk begins, you will not see me up here. The slideshow is a vital part of today's service, and it felt safest to run it from the back of the room in the audiovisual booth. So now at least you can put a face to my disembodied voice.
Our speaker today is John Sproule, a longtime member of Don Heights. He has been collecting NUU biographies since 2009 and presents them periodically in a series of slideshows called UU A to Z. He also presents themed talks once or twice a summer, and this summer is no exception. Today is part one of his most ambitious project to date, NUU York. NUU York. Take it away, John.
Thank you, Lydia. Let me get my screen share going. And away we go. Welcome to another of my summer talks. And this year, sure enough, the topic is NUU York, NUU York. We've already had a chalice lighting quote from Lydia Mariah Child, who published her letters home. I'm being told to be quieter here in the room. Here we go. Hopefully that's going to be better. Yes, Lydia Mariah Child published her letters home while working in New York City. Well, here's another from Charles Dickens, who visited in 1842. What is this dismal fretted pile of bastard Egyptian, like an enchanter's palace in a melodrama? A famous prison called the Tombs. Shall we go in? Yes, by all means, let's go in. Here is New York, all 470 square miles and 5 boroughs. Manhattan is a Lenape word meaning place where we get wood for bows. In English, we'd say Bow Island or Hickory Island. The Hudson River is on the west. Manhattan is separated from the Bronx by skinny Harlem River, which is really a tidal strait. Queens and Brooklyn are on Long Island across the East River, which is a tidal estuary of the Hudson. And Staten Island is across the harbor. I only lived in New York for a short time, but I truly love the city. If some of my jokes missed the mark, please forgive me. My heart is in the right place, even if my words are not. I would never intentionally be rude to New York, even if it did not always feel the same about me. I am an entertainer, not a scholar. I'm sure the show has errors and omissions. I hope you will forgive them and that you will correct them during discussion or in the online chat or in an email to Don Heights. I also have the habit of calling my heroes by their first names. I mean no disrespect. It was not the custom in their time, but it is in our time, and I think it helps to humanize them. As always, I owe a debt to the UU Dictionary of Biography and to Wikipedia. I did warn you, I'm not much of a scholar. And this year, a special shout out to the New York City Organ Project with its helpful history of New York churches. When I covered Concord, Massachusetts 2 years ago, I could say that UUs were central to Concord's story, but not so for New York. New Yorkers outnumber UUs a dozen times and always have. Famous New Yorkers are of every faith and no faith from all over the world, and New York's history is arguably more important than all UU history combined. So I'll just put the spotlight on some of our friends as they run around in the great chaos. We have to limit our scope, so I have no pre-European history. Since early UUism includes a belief in Christianity, we know we're not skipping anyone. Manhattan Island was colonized by the Dutch in 1624 to guard their fur trading monopoly on the Hudson River. 40 years later, there were 9,000 Dutch in North America. 2,500 lived in New Amsterdam, south of this wall, which will become Wall Street. Many were in villages like Harlem on Manhattan Island, connected to the big town by a country road named Broadway. So were any of them Unitarians? Maybe. Socinians from Poland had some converts already in Holland by 1598, but I did not find a connection. In 1664, the English sent 4 frigates to seize New Amsterdam, starting the Second Anglo-Dutch War. It took a third war to end matters, but by 1674, the town was permanently in English hands, and they renamed it New York. Our first UU appears indirectly in 1753. Future Unitarian Benjamin Franklin met with Dr. Samuel Johnson and Dr. William Smith, who were both Anglicans. And these three, called the Educational Triumvirate, discussed young Smith's pamphlet on how to found a college. Then Franklin and Smith founded the University of Pennsylvania, and Johnson founded King's College in New York. After the Revolution, it was renamed Columbia. It's a tenuous connection, but good enough that Columbia University has a bust of Franklin. In the 1770s, New York joined the American Revolution, and at first they fared badly. After the British won the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, New York was occupied from 1776 to 83. More than 10,000 revolutionaries died in prison ships anchored in Wallabout Bay, Brooklyn. Unitarian Paul Revere is remembered for his night ride across Massachusetts, but he was a spy master and courier. He visited New York and Philadelphia 18 times with messages from the Boston Committee of Public Safety. Benjamin Franklin had a non-Unitarian son named William. He was illegitimate but acknowledged and raised by his father. By 1775, William was colonial governor of New Jersey. To his father's horror, he sided with the Tories, or British Loyalists. After a prisoner exchange released William to the British in New York, he organized militia raids against the rebels in New Jersey. His father did not forgive him. I mean that in the most literal possible sense. When Ben was in peace talks with Britain in 1782, he demanded a clause in the treaty. Loyalists who had borne arms against revolutionaries, as William had, were excluded from any general pardon. By 1783, the British had lost. London ordered Commander Guy Carleton to evacuate New York. Carleton stayed 3 extra months to evacuate 29,000 Loyalist refugees. And then, as agreed with General Washington, he left New York at noon on November 25th. Washington reclaimed a fort at Washington Heights and led the Continental Army south on Broadway in a victory parade to Battery Park. The British had pranked the Americans by nailing a British flag to the top of a greased flagpole at the Battery, but it was down before the last British ship dropped over the horizon. Washington put Unitarian Major General John Brooks in charge of the garrison in New York. John would later be governor of Massachusetts. For a short time, New York was the capital of the USA. It was 1789, and the vice president was Unitarian John Adams, shown here with his wife, Abigail. Their residence was a mansion named Richmond Hill. Today it's downtown, but in 1789, it was a country home on 26 acres of wilderness. You walked north into Greenwich Village by crossing a plank over a stream. Abigail loved the place, which was on a hill with a view of the Hudson River. John, perhaps not so much. When the Senate was deadlocked on whether to move the capital to Philadelphia, John cast the tie-breaking vote to go. Portrait artist Gilbert Stuart was Unitarian, as were many of his portrait subjects. Gilbert was born in America, but he was a Tory. He left and honed his skills in Britain. But in 1793, he returned and settled in New York City. He had the specific goal of painting George Washington so that he could get an engraver to reproduce it so that he could make a lot of money. And this worked splendidly, sort of. He did make a fortune, but Gilbert was a spendthrift, a bottomless pit of need. Despite being the best paid artist of his generation, he died in debt. Many of his paintings are in New York today in the Metropolitan and Frick museums. And to finish this section, the revolutionary Thomas Paine spent his last years peacefully in Greenwich Village. There is a Thomas Paine Park in downtown Manhattan. Now, I've been told that these talks go on and cover like 8 or 9 people per minute, and it's hard to remember if you had a question in between. So I'll pause from time to time, like now at the end of a section. I will only take a couple of questions or short comments, which can be a hand raised in the room or a hand raised online or something written in the chat. And there'll be lots of time for discussion afterwards. I, for one, am willing to stay in the afternoon for as long as people want to keep talking about this stuff. Anyway, seeing no hands right now. Oh, I do see a hand right now. Oh.
During this revolutionary period, there were a number of Unitarian. Was there a congregation in New York at the time?
No, there wasn't. And that would be a great segue. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about the first Unitarian congregation as soon as we're into the next section. Which we'll do now. So any other questions about revolutionary New York City are welcome at the end. Jot them down somewhere or put them in the chat or scratch them on the floor here. Anyway, we're going to talk about early builders, Manhattan up to the year 1860. Now that America is in control of New York, let's build it up. This is NUU York, so let's put some congregations on the map. The First Unitarian Church of New York has the best origin story since Spider-Man. Lucy Channing Russell said, "Hey guys, my little brother William is traveling from Boston to Baltimore to give the foundational speech for the American Unitarian movement. Let's ask him to stop and found a society for us." So that's what they did, 40 people meeting in Lucy's house. And in 1820, they built a little square church on Chambers Street. You can see that little one on the map. Their first minister was 24-year-old William Ware. He served for 17 years, as far as I could tell, without too much distinction. Well, their next minister was Charles Follen, best known as Harvard's first linguistics teacher. I am reluctant to tell you why Harvard fired him. He was too outspoken against slavery. And I am reluctant to tell you why he lasted less than a year in New York for the same reason. A congregation in Massachusetts wanted him, but it was not to be. Charles died aboard the steamship Lexington when it caught fire and sank in Long Island Sound. Well, now first Unitarian hired Henry Whitney Bellows. Henry was a fine speaker and the congregation grew. He also edited 2 Unitarian papers, the Christian Inquirer and the Christian Examiner. Let's remember, although UU today is of all faith and no faith, back then it was extremely Christian, even if not all their neighbors agreed. Henry was recognized as a national leader. In 1845, the congregation moved north. They built 845 Broadway near 14th Street and renamed themselves the Church of the Divine Unity. In 10 more years, they will move north again into larger quarters. The fancy brickwork will give them a nickname, the Church of the Holy Zebra. Henry will stay for 43 years, and we'll be seeing him and the zebra again. So backing up to 1825, some members of First left. By the way, 1B, where they moved to, is way up here. The second congregation is starting right here. Maybe I should have used better colors that didn't match the map so well. In 1825, some members of First left and opened Second Unitarian at the corner of Prince and Mercer. Land was cheap that far north. They had a big graveyard, and later they shared it with Third Universalist. They built a small church with a false Greek front, and William Ellery Channing came back to give the opening sermon. The congregation soon called 51-year-old Abner Neeland from Boston. Abner was like, "Yes, I'll come. I was a Universalist at my last church, but I believe what you believe." Now, that wasn't strictly true. Abner was ahead of his time, and he didn't even believe what other Universalists believed. As one 19th century historian put it, his impious ravings soon scattered the congregation. To put it more neutrally, half of the congregation loved Abner, and they left with him in 1827 to form the Prince Street Universalist Society. The half who stayed at Second Unitarian called Orville Dewey as minister. In 1837, fire destroyed their building, and with the northward trend continuing, they rebuilt at 728 Broadway and renamed themselves the Church of the Messiah, and they will be at that address until 1865. Well, now let's follow Abner Neeland and his renegades. Abner himself didn't stay long. In a few years, he'll be back in Massachusetts getting jailed for blasphemy. The society called young Aidan Ballou, but they found him a bad fit. And the congregation said, "Can you get us your famous relative, Hosea Ballou?" Aidan said, "Well, we can ask." Hosea came to check out the prospects. He shocked idealistic Aidan by tough and devious salary negotiations. And in the end, he didn't take the job. While Hosea was in town, Aidan tried to debate the afterlife with him. Hosea believed God's love sends everyone to heaven as soon as they die. Restorationists, like Aidan, believe God's justice requires sinners to be punished first. Hosea wouldn't debate. He just said, "So then, Brother Aidan, you think they'll have to be smoked a little, do you?" Later on, Hosea did preach in New York for 6 months, shortly before his death. I'm not sure if New Yorkers got wealthier or Hosea got less picky. And now we're on to the Second Universalist Society. They opened on Grand Street 3 years after the first. They're numbered 4 on the map. They had a young minister named Abel Thomas. Abel was no slouch and he drew crowds, but since he was only paid room and board, he soon went to Philadelphia. Even so, the society outgrew their building. They bought a church 2 blocks north, becoming the Orchard Street Universalist Church. Still having no money, they hired another cheap youngster, Thomas Jefferson Sawyer. Tom Sawyer grew into the job and expanded the congregation. He also helped create the Universalist Historical Society and remained its secretary and librarian for 65 years, even after he moved to Tufts Divinity School. The Third Universalist Society formed in 1834 with a new building on Bleecker Street in 36. They called William Balch in 41, and he stayed for 18 years. William was born in Vermont. At 17, he took a job at his uncle's meat market, but he was fired because he wouldn't kill the animals. He joined his brother as a teacher in New York City. Abner Nealon converted him there, and William decided to be a minister. While early Universalists were pretty casual about ministry, William just showed up and applied at the 1827 New England General Convention. While Reverend Paul Dean was grilling him on theology, Reverend Sebastian Streeter stood up and said, "Why do you bother the young brother with questions that you, nor I, nor anybody else can answer? If he wants to preach, why not let him try? He seems to be as well qualified as we were." William spent the next decade teaching and preaching around New England, including 2 months teaching Tom Sawyer how to be a minister. William may have given Tom his love of history too. William did important original research into Universalism. So, spoiler alert, none of these 3 Universalist societies will last into the 20th century, even though Universalism was bigger than Unitarianism in New York City. Out of 7 Universalist societies formed in Manhattan, only 1 is active today. Now, before we look at the survivor, let's follow the 6th Universalist Society to its demise. Based on my sketchy research, the 6th might be a new incarnation of the 3rd. The dates and the geography are close anyway. In 1867, 6th Universalist was on 33rd Street, and their Reverend Brooks was replaced by James Pullman, a brother of the famous railroad car Pullman. Everyone keeps moving north. Most members of 6th were wealthy and had moved close to the glorious new Central Park. So 6th Universalist bought land near the park on 57th Street, and they spent $150,000 to build one of the finest churches in the city. The congregation had pledged enough money to pay the whole debt. But then came Black Friday, a stock market crash in 1869. 6th did complete the new building in 1874, but many pledgers had been ruined, and the church was stuck with a debt of $80,000. When new minister Joseph Mason arrived in 1885, he found a debt of $50,000 and only 100 members in a building that could hold 1,400. To make matters worse for them, the 4th Universalist Society had built close by. Reverend Mason thrashed around a bit, but in the end, the congregation sold the building, and I see them no more. I did notice that 6th Universalists gave generously to outside charities, even during their financial troubles. I think the members of my own congregation, Don Heights, can relate. We are solvent, but we're precarious. Even so, about 15% of what we collect goes right back out the door. We'd like to be here in 100 years, but we attach greater importance to doing some good while we are here. One Universalist church does make it into the 21st century. Sorry, this scrolls faster than I expect. The 4th Universalist Society is a success story. They named themselves the Church of the Divine Paternity in 1848, but they went back to calling themselves Fourth Universalist in 1967. Their congregation made the usual trek north. They were on Murray Street, moved to Broadway and Greenwich Village, to 5th and 45th, and finally to 160 Central Park at 76th Street in 1898. They have a lovely building. It has been called the Cathedral of Universalism. NBC uses it every year to cover Macy's Thanksgiving parade. Thomas Lake Harris was an early minister at Fourth. He left his mark on New York by founding the New York Juvenile Asylum, a nonprofit boarding school for troubled children. It still operates today as the Children's Village, New York. Thomas has a weird future ahead of himself, but that's out of scope, so we won't discuss his pilgrimage today. Edwin Chapin was the next minister at Fourth and stayed for 32 years. Although he was shy, he was a great speaker, and he built attendance to over 2,000. I guess some of them poached from Sixth Universalist. His wife is remembered for founding the Chapin Home for the Aged and Infirm. It still runs today, although it's now in Queens. Edwin is remembered for his poem Ocean Burial, which morphed into the cowboy song, Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie. Well, that's enough churches. New York contains so much more. And we're going to see what else UU's built here before the Civil War. Oops, but before, let me just see if I know how to back up. Before we do that, we can have another break if people have questions or comments on the early congregations. But if you like, you can also save them up till the end. We do have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm just going to plunge ahead. Here's Samuel Morse, best known for the telegraph and Morse code, but he was also a successful painter and an early promoter of photography. After studying in England, where he became a member of the Royal Academy, Samuel settled in New York and co-founded the National Academy of Design, 1826. He was its first president, serving for 20 years. I will not dwell on Samuel's New York politics, which do him no credit. He ran for mayor on an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, pro-slavery platform. And I'm happy to say he got less than 1,500 votes. In other ways, though, there's a lot to admire. He lived modestly and he gave generously to charity. He is buried in Brooklyn and he has a statue in Central Park. Peter Cooper. Peter is today's first native New Yorker. He was the fifth son of a hat maker and worked a variety of hands-on trades. At age 30, he bought a glue factory on Sunfish Pond, which is where today is East 33rd Street. The pond is gone, like most Manhattan streams. Peter was a great innovator, but he was no ecologist. His glue factory killed the pond. It was drained and filled in 1839. Peter had a patent for a powdered gelatin. He sold it to a mom and pop business who renamed it Jello. Even so, Peter is better known for designing and building America's first successful locomotive, the Tom Thumb. He built it from spare parts he had lying around as a favor to the B&O Railroad, because no one at the railroad knew how to make one. Peter needed the B&O to succeed because he had invested everything in 3,000 acres of land, an iron mine, and an iron works in Maryland. He sold the B&O a right of way and the rails to build their track, and it made him a massive fortune. Peter took his fortune back to Manhattan and invested in insurance, real estate, and the telegraph, becoming New York's richest man. Through it all, he dressed simply, had just 2 servants, and traded an expensive carriage that his wife bought for a plain one. There was nothing extravagant about him, except perhaps that beard. Peter joined Second Unitarian in 1838. He moved to All Souls, or First, in 1855. He was socially and politically active, and unlike Samuel Morse, he was on the side of the angels. He was anti-slavery, anti-usury, advocated for Christian charity as the solution to social injustice, and fought for First Nations rights. Politically, he was a New York alderman. He was also an unsuccessful third-party candidate for president. His children did better. Son Edward and son-in-law Abram Hewitt each became mayor of New York. Peter's later life was centered in Gramercy Park, still known as a well-to-do neighborhood of brownstone houses east of Broadway, from 14th to 23rd Street. Today, the high-rise apartments to the east are called Peter Cooper Village. And a few blocks south is Cooper Union. Peter founded the Cooper Union for the advancement of science and art in 1859. It's still on Cooper Square. It's a college known for art, architecture, and engineering, with a total of 5 buildings in the Bowery. This is the original foundation building, changed but still recognizable. And this is 41 Cooper Square, the Irvin S. Channon School of Architecture. Peter lived for 92 fruitful years, and he's now buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Here's my favorite Universalist, Phineas P.T. Barnum. Much of his career was lived in New York. P.T. is on the left, posing with Tom Thumb. That's P.T. on the left of Tom Thumb. A postcard for Barnum's American Museum is on the right. The building was originally Scudder's American Museum on Broadway at Park Row, which is 7 blocks north of Wall Street. P.T. bought it for a song when another buyer was late with a payment. He renovated for 4 years and opened in 1845. Flags on the roof grabbed attention by day, and the facade was lit by limelight at night. It was the real deal inside, with a grand staircase leading to various rooms. It had a large lecture hall with 3 levels of seating. The museum had a fascinating variety of bona fide scientific marvels mixed with outrageous spectacles and outright frauds. The top left shows a family enjoying part of the zoo, which also included a tiger and 2 live beluga whales. The bottom left shows his most famous fraud, the Fiji mermaid, which is actually just a monkey skeleton sewn onto a fishtail. The museum also had a real Portuguese man of war on display, and who's to say which one looks stranger to a 19th century visitor. Barnum used to leak stories to the press that his attractions were fake. He even claimed some of the real ones were fake, so that people would come back and check for themselves. P.T. produced the 60-page book on the right, priced 12.5 cents, with pictures and descriptions of the exhibits. 27 pages were paid advertisements because we're talking about Barnum. The rest describe the wax museum, the portrait gallery, statues, costumes, large crystals, a mummy, a suit of armor, primitive tools from around the world, and the birds and animals. On most days, you could also see the so-called freak show, people tall and short, thin and fat, hairy, albino, and so forth. The skeleton man and the mammoth lady weren't really that extreme, but hey, that's not the next picture. There we go. The skeleton lady and the mammoth lady weren't really that extreme, but P.T. claimed that Susan Barton weighed 576 pounds. Some show people were regulars, but others came and went. Mariah Child came to see some Plains Indians in 1843. I'm sorry to report that they slept indoors beside a charcoal burner, and 2 of them died from carbon monoxide poisoning. In October 1860, the show stealers were Chang and Eng Bunker, the original Siamese twins. They were 49 years old then and already world famous and semi-retired. They had married a pair of sisters, and they had shown questionable moral and financial judgment by buying a small slave plantation in North Carolina. Excellent investment in 1860. They were the best wood choppers in the state, using 4 hands on the axe. They went back on the road occasionally to raise college money for their 21 children. On a good day, Barnum's Museum attracted 15,000 visitors. In its 24 years of operation, it had 38 million customers, way over the population of the United States. My screen has done something strange to me here. Can I still find my way? I guess so. When the Civil War came, PT was strongly pro-union, a fact not lost on an 8-man terrorist group who called themselves the Confederate Army of Manhattan. On November 25th, 1864, they started 20 fires in an attempt to burn down New York. The American Museum was one of their targets. All the fires failed to spread and did little damage. But in July 1865, Barnum's Museum burned to the ground. Large animals escaped, only to be shot or clubbed to death on Broadway. I'm afraid the belugas boiled in their tanks. Barnum quickly reopened in a new building, but Barnum's new museum only lasted until 1868 before it too burned. This time, Barnum picked up and packed up and took a show on the road, eventually merging into the Barnum and Bailey Circus. Well, that gets him out of New York, so we'll move on to today's next guest. Calvert Vaux was a British architect and landscaper. After 2 years in Washington, he came to live in New York. His first building was the Jefferson Market Library in Greenwich Village, still part of the New York Public Library system today. Calvert became a US citizen, joined Morse's National Academy of Design and the Century Club, and he was part of the Guild, an informal artist community, kind of like the later Algonquin Roundtable for writers. He wrote Villas and Cottages, a popular book that earned a good review from Ralph Waldo Emerson. In 1857, New York wanted a large park built around the Croton Receiving Reservoir. The reservoir had been completed in 1842 to fight cholera and yellow fever caused by polluted groundwater. Maria Child saw it while it was filling up, and she admired it for its beautiful fountains. The reservoir is no longer used for drinking water today. It's now the site of Central Park's Great Lawn and Turtle Pond. Calvert recruited Frederick Law Olmsted, and together they won the commission for the park. Olmsted was the main architect, but Calvert fought tenaciously to keep the city from altering the design. Here are a few slides for Central Park. It has many attractions, 42 million visitors per year, and claims to be the most filmed location in the world. Yeah, kind of believable. This is Bethesda Fountain and the lake, and this is the restored underpass at Bethesda Terrace. Central Park is New York's most famous and most visited park, but it's just one of many and only the 5th largest. Calvert and his team also designed Morningside in Upper Manhattan and Prospect Park and Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn. Calvert's firm designed many New York buildings, including the Samuel J. Tilden House, now headquarters of the National Arts Club, and the original, now hidden Gothic exteriors of the American Museum of Natural History and Metropolitan Museum of Art. At age 71, Calvert drowned in Gravesend Bay. In 1998, the city dedicated Calvert Vaux Park in Brooklyn beside the bay, north of Coney Island and looking across to Staten Island. So we're done with buildings. We still are going to talk about people. But this would be a good time to, again, ask if there's any question or short discussion. It's okay if there isn't, because we're just going to keep on with the show. So let's look at New York's social justice warriors. And we'll also see some eccentrics. But there's a lot of people in New York, even up to 1860, and we're going to save the literary lights until our next show, which is going to be on August 21st. But today, we have Orestes Brownson. Even though he was a minister, Orestes was famous for changing his religion. Mariah Child even mentions it in Letters from New York. And because of that, we can't feel too proud that Orestes was a Universalist and a Unitarian and a Transcendentalist. Before turning 33, he was also a Congregationalist, Deist, Atheist, and Presbyterian. When parishioners weren't complaining about his radical tolerance, they were complaining about his blatant socialism. He was happiest when he was minister at large to Boston's working class, working for social justice. But Orestes lived 3 times in New York City: at age 14 for a year of schooling at an academy, at age 26 supporting the Socialist Working Men's Party of New York, and then by the 3rd stay, after age 52, Orestes had made his final transformation into a conservative Catholic, repudiating both socialism and Protestantism. Even then, his mind was his own, and he found new controversies within his Catholic family. Orestes annoyed people. He wasn't comfortable to be around. He criticized and he supported the underdog, but they respected him because his criticisms made sense. You might not agree, but he was not easily dismissed. By 1870, he left all his fights behind and edited the Dubuque Chess Journal. Strangely, Dubuque, Iowa published one of only 2 journals in the world dedicated entirely to chess. And here is Robert Wedderburn. His father was an attainted British nobleman. That basically means treasonous. His mother was a Jamaican slave. He was free, but raised by his slave mother and a grandmother, and he was often flogged for insubordination. He was in the Navy, in London ghettos, a Unitarian minister in London Soho, an anarchist, and in prison several times for theft, blasphemy, and running a brothel. You can't tell by my summary, but he was an important voice in progressive British thought. I don't know when Robert reached New York, but he was there at age 70. The New York Evening Star reported a Robert Wedderburn involved in a fraud case and called him, quote, a tailor and breeches maker, field preacher, anti-bank deposit politician, romance writer, circulating librarian, and ambulating dealer in drugs, deism, and demoralization in general, unquote. He returned to London soon after. Here's my lady, Lydia Mariah Child, an American writer and activist. At age 22, she wrote her first novel in just 6 weeks. It caused a scandal because the white heroine married a Native American. Mariah championed Indigenous rights and protested Indigenous wrongs all her life. She wrote anti-slavery fiction and an essay on why moral people must disobey the Fugitive Slave Act. Mariah also wrote poems, children's stories, and a book on housekeeping. Her best-known work, though, is a poem, Over the River and Through the Wood, to Grandfather's House We Go. Tufts University restored her grandfather's house on the Mystic River, and it's a Boston tourist attraction. Mariah lived in NYC from 1841 to 43, editing the weekly National Anti-Slavery Standard. She later published her letters as a book, and I thank her for her eyewitness accounts. She was very in tune with the river and the harbor, and she writes a lot about the contrast between the rich and the poor. Lucy Stone was a suffragist, known for keeping her last name after marriage. When her local government gave women the vote, Lucy missed out because she refused to register as Mrs. Blackwell. Lucy wasn't based in New York, but she visited whenever suffragist business took her there. She attended a convention in 1836, age 18. In 1853, at age 35, she lectured in New York with short hair and bloomers, kind of equivalent to burning your bra in the 1960s. Whenever she lectured outside New York, as she did all over the country, Horace Greeley's New York Tribune helped keep her in the public eye. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, "Lucy Stone was the first speaker who really stirred the nation's heart on the subject of women's wrongs." I include her in part because in 1921, a New York journalist, Ruth Hale, will found the Lucy Stone League. Ms. Hale fought in court for her right to use her birth name on legal documents. As she said, the only one in her household called Mrs. Haywood Brown was the cat. Helen Hunt Jackson first saw New York at age 16, attending the Abbott Brothers boarding school. She began writing at 17, and Ralph Waldo Emerson admired and often quoted her poems. In 1879, Helen heard a lecture by Chief Standing Bear. Standing Bear was on the lecture circuit after winning a legal victory, a story I tell under the letter J. The courts had only recently ruled that Native Americans were, quote, persons within the meaning of the law, unquote. That gave Standing Bear freedom to live where he chose. Nebraska honored him with a statue in the National Statuary Hall at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Helen was horrified by Standing Bear's story, which features many deaths caused by government negligence. In addition to fierce lobbying for Native Americans, she wrote her great history book, A Century of Dishonor. She then traveled to New York, where she lived in a hotel for 3 months and wrote her best-selling novel, Ramona. It publicized the plight of Native Americans in California, much as her friend Harriet Beecher Stowe had done for Black slaves with Uncle Tom's Cabin. Helen returned to the American West and died soon after. She is buried in Colorado Springs. Well, here are two of Lucy Stone's sisters-in-law, the doctors Blackwell. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to graduate from a modern medical school. She fought on 2 continents for decades against medical male prejudice. Her sister Emily followed in her footsteps. Elizabeth and Emily were born in England and came to live in New York with their parents in 1832. Elizabeth was 11, Emily 6. In a few years, they all moved to Cincinnati. After facing surprising adventures and nearly insurmountable prejudice in America and Europe, Elizabeth came back to New York at age 30. She had a medical degree and a glass eye that stopped her from becoming a surgeon. With favorable newspaper coverage from Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, can you tell that Horace Greeley is a Unitarian, by the way? And with money from writing and lectures, she established a dispensary on the Lower East Side in 1853. In 1857, she was joined by Sister Emily. They expanded the dispensary into the New York Infirmary for indigent women and children. It was soon a going concern with many patients and a nurse's training facility. In 1868, they added a medical college for women. The sisters had a power struggle and a falling out after that. Emily stayed and ran the New York enterprise, while Elizabeth went to London and established another new college. Emily also fought uphill against male prejudice, but she had a more straightforward career. She served at her New York teaching hospital for 43 years, becoming professor of obstetrics and dean of the college. At age 74, she vacationed for 18 months with her co-worker and best friend, Elizabeth Cushier, and then they retired together to a house in Montclair, New Jersey. 15 miles west from Manhattan. I've been talking a long time. I am getting near the end. Here's Daniel Webster. Perhaps like me, you know Daniel best from the one-act play by Stephen Vincent Benet, The Devil and Daniel Webster. Basically, he's a great orator. Daniel was never a New Yorker, but his second wife, Carolyn, was born there and lived there as a widow. Perhaps that's why there's a statue of Daniel in Central Park. It's 100 meters from 71st Street, south of Strawberry Fields and southwest of the lake. And Daniel was Secretary of State for Millard Fillmore, our least impressive Unitarian president. Elected as VP, he became president in 1850 when Zachary Taylor died. My favorite US historian, Dave Barry, lists these highlights of the Fillmore administration. Number one, the Earth did not crash into the sun. And that is the end of the list. Millard wasn't a New Yorker either, so why are he and Daniel in my show? Well, I like them for a train trip they took together in May 1851. After 22 years of work, the New York and Erie Railroad finally reached Dunkirk, a town on Lake Erie. President Fillmore, 51, and Secretary of State Webster, 69, were aboard for the inaugural run from New York City. Millard rode in a presidential caboose and gave a speech from the back railing at every stop. Daniel made the trip in a rocking chair attached to a flat car. He brought a steamer rug and a bottle of Medford rum. Whenever Millard spoke, Daniel got off the train and spoke from the ground. Well, that concludes today's talk, but I will return on August 21st with part 2. We'll start with, I've got my slides mixed up. I'm going to flash ahead and show these as I talk through them. We'll start with New York's UU literary lights, including William Cullen Bryant, who built the New York Post, Horace Greeley, who founded the New York Tribune, Margaret Fuller and George Ripley, two of Horace's superstar writers, and Walt Whitman, the epitome of 19th century New York, and Horatio Alger, muse of the American dream. I think I'm telling a lie. I think the August story is too long, and I'm going to leave Horatio until 2023. We will also tour New York's other 4 boroughs, each a fair-sized city in its own right. So I hope I have convinced you New York is worth our time, because I want to show a lot of it over the next 2 years, maybe even 3 years. I've always loved the city, and it has been home to some of our most remarkable UUs. The end.